Yeah, food price is always a lively question, and one which there's been a lot of controversy on lately. If you think back to the 2008-9 food crisis, food prices were rising dramatically. There was a strong feeling that they would rise out into the future, and a pretty dire scenario for particularly for those importing food. Since then, food prices have come down in many parts of the world. Certainly at world prices have come down, and they've come down more towards the long-term trend. So depending on the perspective you take, whether it's 1 year at a time or a decade or a century, your answer is different. Over the last century, food prices have had this long-term downward trend. But if you look at certain periods, like the recent period, they spike up and spike up very dramatically, and that can cause a lot of civil unrest, stress, even in some cases governments being toppled. So obviously a very sensitive topic. If we're thinking long run, taking this long sweep of time, if you go back to the 1970s, this price spike was even higher at that time. And it's subsequently came down and then spiked. So our best guess is that the long-term trend will continue to be a downward one, and that's because worldwide population growth is slowing, and at some point, even with income growth, people become satiated, they can't eat anymore, and their diets more or less stabilize. So we think in the long run, food prices will continue their downward trend, but in the near term, there can be these dramatic ups and downs. And those ups and downs are most problematic and even exacerbated when countries choose to block exports, for example, embargo exports, which happened for rice during that period. And that's what kicked off the big price increase. Actually, in that period of the rapid spike where rice prices doubled or more, there wasn't, actually, if you look back, there wasn't a dramatic change in the amount of rice produced in the world. It was all panic around countries, important exporters like Thailand, banning their exports. So as a result, there was this reaction, and other countries closed their borders, and that's always the concern for food importers. I think from the long-term availability point of view, there will be sufficient food and world prices will be modest. It's this short-term spike that's the greatest concern. And there, we really have to rely on a rules-based economy, and we've been moving away from that recently. But that's the idea behind the WTO. Trade, don't fight. Okay, most of these international institutions after World War II were put in place to promote more trade and less danger of military conflict. So yeah, my broad response is that the long-term trend will be downward. There will continue to be spikes, and those spikes will be worse the more countries seek to insulate themselves from it. No, that's a really important point, and I think that there are really two views of the world as we go forward. One is a world with more or less segmented or markets that are largely separated from world markets, and in that case, local water scarcity could have a significant effect on food prices. But trade can play a very significant role in overcoming these scarcities, and in some places, some parts of the world, under climate change, there'll be more precipitation. The potential for trade to even these things out is significant. I think in a world in which there is reasonably free trade in agricultural products, we could overcome a lot of these local scarcities by shifting production, importing the food from elsewhere where water is more available. But there's no doubt that water scarcity at a local and regional level is going to play a very significant role in where food gets produced in the future. I think a good example might be the case of Japan. After the war, they were scared to death of importing. And yet it's in the end, a small group of islands with a lot of people and a lot of industrial might. And I remember attending the first international conference I attended was in Japan, and the Minister of Agriculture stood up and said, "We're never going to import more than 30% or 40% of our rice." Well, it's continued. The import shares continue to increase, certainly for other food products. In the end, it's just not practical to produce all the food locally, given the fact that they're a wealthy country and they can afford to buy it elsewhere. So I think they're better off investing in the international architecture that will ensure free and fluid trade. And I would say the same for this region, that given the impending water scarcity, continuing to produce more food and feed the growing population, the rapidly growing population, from natural resources in the region, it's going to be very costly in terms of the environment, and you're eventually not going to have water to drink if you're irrigating these food products. So I think the region's going to have to rely on international markets, have to export other things, whether it's tourism services or manufacturers, oil or whatnot. So it's going to be important to invest, I think, in the international trading system. It's unfortunate right now that that's being dismantled. The U.S. has certainly not been supportive of that recently, and that's a real tragedy. But I think it's that international architecture that we have to turn back to, and we have to invest in the future in order to ensure free and open trade in food products, because that's critical. If we don't trade, we may end up at war, and that's the last thing we want. So I think there's great advantage to relying on trade, and the historical evidence is that despite best intents, whether it's in Japan or elsewhere, to be self-sufficient, it's simply not feasible and not practical. Investing politically, economically, and other ways in open trading system is a very important avenue for the future, and one we're neglecting presently, and potentially this region could play more of a leadership role in that.
Thank you so much.